are talking SHRIEKSHOW. Now this one is directed by Brad Twigg. It has a few familiar names in it, albeit they are in very short, small roles, such as Felicia Rose, Julianne Prescott, Tuesday Night, for example. And the movie comprises of a wraparound story and three individual kind of segment stories, one of which kind of relates to the wraparound. So let's give you a brief idea on the plot. The kind of the wraparound focuses on four young people decide they're going to go visit this abandoned sort of carnival kind of type place, but it's not abandoned because we have this spooky ringmaster there who tells them these three stories, and then there's kind of a continuation with that story towards the end. The three stories. The first one kind of involves two kind of like FBI agents, I suppose. It's not actually clear exactly what kind of agency they're from, but I'm assuming somewhere like FBI. And they're kind of going to investigate some murders. They kind of run across this woman who needs some help and discover something possibly otherworldly. The second one is about this kind of group of friends who are going to a fishing trip out in the kind of the middle of nowhere. They meet a local, tells them there's a better fishing spot, and it turns out he may well have malicious intent towards them, feeding them to some otherworldly creature. And then the third one is about a kind of a killer clown. This young boy who at the beginning of the segment sort of sees this kind of clown massacre his friends and family, and ever since then he's kind of been tormented by kind of visions of this clown. But are they visions, or is there actually a kind of a real clown out there? And then we have obviously the conclusion to the wraparound story as well. So what do we think? It's a very low budget movie. If you're not a fan of cheap effects, cheap kind of like camera work, not particularly fantastic acting, this movie will not be for you. But if you can kind of maybe look past that, what do I think works in this movie? Now, with the budget in mind, which is low, I will say I was actually quite impressed with some of the kind of the practical makeup here. The movie wisely stays away from kind of CGI like effects. There's the tendency these days, because you can get these kind of like cheap drop-in effects, is for low budget indie movies to rely a little bit too heavily on that. And, you know, it makes a cheap movie look cheaper. This one, thankfully, actually uses a lot of kind of practical effects. And, yeah, some of the kind of the body parts and the kind of this, severed heads look clearly fake and rubbery. But there are some instances where I do think the makeup looks pretty effective. For example, we have this kind of killer clown at the end of the kind of in the third sort of segment, and I've got to say I thought his makeup looked great. Really kind of like a zombie-looking clown. I thought he looked very good. We have a kind of like werewolf-ish monster in the second movie. Again, I thought the makeup looked pretty good. And then we even have a kind of a devil, which is kind of played a little bit for a gag, and maybe that's the weakest one in regards to kind of like the practical makeup, but nonetheless it still is more flamboyant than I was possibly expecting. So the makeup is gotta say it was quite good for clearly a low budget movie. Now, because this movie only has three stories rather than a lot of them, these anthologies will have 5, 6, sometimes even more, but it only has three, which makes the actual segments a little longer. So you actually get a little bit more meat on the bones. Now, for example, with a lot of kind of like when you watch a feature-length horror film, you'll have like the kind of like the non-main, the kind of like other separate characters who are not in the kind of the main cast, almost be like your pre-kill. They're kind of like these victims that are not really part of the main story, but it's just to demonstrate the kind of like the threat that is out there. And now with anthologies, because of the short running time, you'll get straight into the kind of the main story. But in these ones, you do actually get some kind of like some kills from non-main characters, because the movie has the segments have a little more time to kind of do this. And for example, in our sort of our second segment, we have these two kind of women that are camping, and we see obviously what occurs there essentially, and then we kind of go into our group of main characters. So these movies feel like more of a, what would have been a kind of feature-length film shrunk down into a, you know, a segment ultimately. So you get a little bit more of a traditional style storytelling in these 3 segments. And as such, you get a little bit more characterization with some of these people as well. One of the critiques I often have with anthologies is because of the short run time of this segment, you never really connect with characters because you don't have the time to really spend with them. But you think this one gives these characters a little bit more kind of time to kind of be fleshed out. And their stories are quite varied as well. So, I mean, they all actually have a kind of a supernatural twist to it. So, you know, I got to say there's a little bit of variety in stories. The wraparound story itself, I got to say the kind of the location or set design, whatever they're using, looks really good. This kind of abandoned kind of like carnival kind of type place looks pretty kind of menacing. You know, and our Ringmaster as well, I've got to say, is quite a kind of a fun character. What doesn't work in this movie? This movie kind of, unfortunately, really does suffer from a cheapness feel to it. Among a few different things. On a technical level, the way this movie is filmed and kind of put together, it just screams kind of low budget. For example, in our last segment, actually it's our wraparound story, excuse me, that kind of towards the end of the kind of the wraparound story, there's a horrendous use of day for night scenes where they clearly film in the day but just kind of like put a filter on it to make it look dark. But you can clearly see like light reflecting and things like this where it clearly isn't, you know, obviously it's filmed in kind of like low light. It really looks kind of fake. Some of the kind of the camera work, there's a little bit over reliance on kind of tracking shots. And I thought actually, when I was watching, for example, I thought, you know, mixing up the shots, I thought, man, there's a lot of tracking shots in this movie. Just, you know, just a little bit that you kind of notice really. And just the kind of the general, like the way this movie is framed and edited, it just looks a little bit kind of like cheap and low budget at times. Which leads me on to the acting, which I think probably, which is the critique I think most people will probably latch onto. The acting is very kind of cheesy. Now, it's obviously a low budget B movie. When a movie like this, which is clearly not trying to be too serious, you know, I can be a little bit forgiving of some kind of hammy acting. But I have to mention it because I feel some people wouldn't. I feel the problem is here is there's quite a lot of characters, quite a lot of actors in this movie because obviously it's 4 separate stories including the wraparounds. So you have a lot of kind of different kind of parts here. And the majority of the acting here is quite hammy. Some worse than others, and we do get our more established you know, names like Felicia Rose, but they're only in very, very kind of small parts, you know. It's obviously like one day of, maybe not even one day, like, you know, a couple of hours shooting just so we can put the name on the kind of the poster and things like that. So they don't really have any real impact. And I have to be honest with you as well, some of this scenes seem superfluous, like the scene involving Felicia Rose, for example. It's clearly just filmed at maybe her house or someone's house, and you know, they kind of like incorporate it into the story, but it actually has no bearing on the kind of the actual plot itself. So there is a little bit of kind of like fat that could have been trimmed down. I think they kind of just like, you know, worked around some of the actors rather than having the actors kind of work with the film, so to speak. But yeah, the acting, unfortunately, for a lot of the cast here, and surprisingly, some of the kind of the more major roles as well, I've got to say, are have some of the kind of the weaker actions. Some of the kind of like the actual the kind of action sequences, if you want to call it that, the kills are quite poorly filmed. There's a for example, a shootout in the first story where we have this kind of FBI agent, you know, he's defending himself against these antagonists, should we call them? But it's incredibly badly kind of put together with what looks like shots that are repeated, and just kind of like silly kind of like our bad guys just kind of dodging bullets by the looks of it. So yeah, it's kind of like just kind of a little bit hammy. And I've got to say, some of the kind of though I quite enjoy some kind of like, you know, goofy looking kind of VFX at times. We have, for example, a demon baby in one scene. It's like, oh man, maybe they should have thought about something different with this one, because it kind of looks a little bit too silly at times. I don't know if the stories are particularly kind of gripping. They're kind of like, they're interesting enough that I think you have a little bit more time with these ones compared to a lot of anthology movies. But maybe it would have been benefited from having maybe a fourth story and have the other movies be a little bit more punchy, because I do think sometimes this movie spins its wheels a little bit. And the wraparound story as well, I thought it ended relatively kind of weakly, to be honest. I actually don't think this is a terrible film, if you don't mind a kind of a B movie. It certainly has some cheesy charm. Now, that's one thing I will say. The movie does have a kind of a schlocky funness to it that is not going to appeal, I would suggest, to mainstream film goers. But if you are kind of like a bit of a connoisseur of the B movie, like myself, you still can't be somewhat kind of charmed by its funny goofiness and somewhat inventiveness, even though it's not always successful in that. But I can't actually say this is a good film necessarily, because it's just a little bit buckles under its own weight, certainly with budgetary reasons. But I think just some of the quality control is a little bit kind of hit and miss, shall we say. So I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.